Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
All my life, my parents swore they were putting money aside for me, smiling as they said things like, "Don't worry, sweetheart, your future is secure. We're saving for your college." I grew up with that reassurance tucked neatly into the back of my mind, believing that when the time came to step into the world, I'd have a foundation, a safety net, something to reward all the hours I spent bent over my books instead of going to parties. But the day finally arrived when I needed that promise to be real, when I sat in the admissions office staring down tuition numbers that seemed almost unreal, and I called my parents with excitement, asking them how we should go about transferring the funds they'd always talked about. That was when the lie came crashing down around me. My mom's voice, normally quick to fill silence, lingered for too long on the other end of the line before she finally muttered, "Well, honey, things were tighter than we expected. There really isn't a fund." It was like the floor beneath me disappeared. I pressed, asking what she meant, asking if she was joking, asking if she remembered every single time she told me not to worry because it was handled. But she just sighed and passed the phone to my dad, who tried to soften it by saying, "Life happens, bills piled up, and we thought you'd figure out another way." I sat there in that stiff office chair, hearing the words echo, realizing that not only was the money gone, but the trust one had placed in them had vanished just as quickly. They hadn't even warned me. They had let me plan my entire teenage years around a promise that had never actually existed. I remember hanging up the phone with a polite "okay," though my hands were trembling. I walked out into the heat of that August afternoon, surrounded by other students who were buzzing with excitement about their dorm assignments and meal plans, while I felt like I was standing outside the gates of a party I was never invited to. The embarrassment settled deep, because it wasn't just the lack of money, it was the feeling that I had been foolish to believe them, foolish to think my hard work and their assurances meant anything in the end. The next weeks were a blur of panic. I filled out loan applications, begged for extensions, begged for extra hours at the diner I'd only taken as a summer job, and calculated how many shifts it would take to cover one semester. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the cracked ceiling of my small off-campus rental, and hearing the laughter of the girls in the apartment next door who didn't have to worry about whether their classes would be canceled if tuition didn't get paid on time. I told myself I could endure anything if it meant getting my degree, but the resentment had already begun to coil tight inside me. Then came the moment that turned resentment into rage. I had driven home one weekend, desperate to grab some of my old things to sell, hoping maybe a laptop or jewelry I'd been gifted would fetch enough to cover part of my tuition bill. I walked through the door and heard voices in the kitchen. My parents were laughing, and I paused, still hidden in the hallway, because the name I heard next made my skin prickle. They were talking about my brother, Daniel. He was the golden child, the pride of their lives, the one who could do no wrong. He had coasted through high school with mediocre grades, but had somehow convinced them he was destined to become a lawyer. And there it was, spilling casually from my father's lips as if it were nothing. "It's worth every penny to pay for his law school. He'll make us proud." My mother agreed, her voice warm with satisfaction, as she described the tuition payments they had just completed and how Daniel wouldn't have to worry about debt like other kids. I froze, my hands gripping the strap of my bag until my knuckles whitened. It wasn't that the money didn't exist at all. It wasn't that times were impossibly tight. It was that the money existed for him, just not for me. Every life happens excuse, every sigh, every apology suddenly felt like a dagger twisted in my chest. They had looked me straight in the eye for years and told me not to worry, only to funnel every dollar into Daniel's future while telling me my path would work itself out. I stood there in that narrow hallway, listening to them celebrate his good fortune, and something hardened inside me. It wasn't just disappointment anymore, it was clarity. I finally saw the truth of how I ranked in their world, and the realization was as sharp as glass under bare feet. My parents had made their choice. They had chosen him, and in doing so, they had pushed me to the outside of a family I thought I belonged to. I didn't storm in or confront them right then. Instead, I walked silently back out the front door, the weight of my bag pulling at my shoulder as if to remind me that I was alone in this, and if I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. As I sat behind the wheel of my car and started the engine, I felt the sting of tears threatening, but I forced them back, gripping the steering wheel until my palms hurt. For the first time in my life, I knew with complete certainty that I could never again take them at their word. The lie had been revealed, and the damage was permanent. What I didn't know that night, as I drove back to campus in silence, was just how far that betrayal would echo through the years ahead, or how one day, long after the sting of student loans and sleepless nights, the tables would turn in a way none of them could have imagined. I learned quickly that independence looks a lot less like a motivational poster and a lot more like lugging a crate of pre-dawn produce through a back hallway that smells like bleach and burnt coffee while calculating, in my head and without blinking, how many hours behind the register I'll need to cover a lab fee that mysteriously ballooned after the drop deadline. And while I folded napkins and wiped tables, Daniel posted photos from a renovated apartment with a balcony and a view and a tiny succulent lined up with his casebooks like a staged magazine spread, which would have been cute if the caption under it hadn't been "Focus and Sacrifice," a phrase that landed in my throat like a dry pill as I stirred another pot of noodles with a plastic fork because my one pan was soaking, and the heat had been turned down again to shave dollars off the bill. Every time I came home, my parents acted like I had wandered off from a tour group despite all the maps they had handed me, smiling with that thin patience that knows it is right, explaining that law school was an investment, a long-term strategy with a return. Whereas my degree, which involved labs and internships and a lot of unpaid learning that somehow still cost money, was, my mother loved this word, exploratory, as though I had decided to backpack through my own future without a compass, just to see whether there was a cliff. Meanwhile, Daniel had a new laptop that matched his car, a car my dad said he got a steal on by paying in cash, which was interesting given the refrain about tight times. That played like elevator music whenever my tuition came up, and I developed this split-screen habit in my head where I would picture him at a mahogany library table while I mopped the diner floor and told myself that grit grows best in fluorescent light. When the dinner invitation arrived, family celebration, my mother wrote in a group text with way too many exclamation marks. I almost ignored it. Except the restaurant was the kind where the bread comes in a basket you are supposed to pretend not to eat, and the wine list reads like a list of people who went to private school, and curiosity is free. So I put on a dress I'd worn to a scholarship interview and slipped an envelope into my purse that I had labeled, in tidy letters, receipts. Daniel was already seated when I walked in, shining with the soft light of being well-funded, and my parents looked relaxed in the way people do when they believe the evening will be smooth, because they rehearsed their lines in the car. They asked about my dorm and my classes and whether I was finding my way, a phrase that I once loved, but now recognized as code for "we are not helping you," and then the waiter poured something fragrant into tall glasses while Daniel adjusted his cuff and lifted his drink. He stood, and in his best future courtroom voice, he thanked our parents for believing in him through every step, gesturing to the ceiling as though gratitude had to bounce off the chandeliers to count. And from the adjacent table I heard a woman murmur the kind of admiration that comes prepackaged for sons who seem to be going somewhere grand. I felt the envelope pressing against my ribs like a secret trying to breathe, and, before I fully decided to do it, I stood as well, not to argue, I told myself, but to add a footnote to the family legend that had been drafted without me. I said that I also wanted to toast our parents, because belief is a powerful thing, and I had grown up on it, bedtime stories about a college fund with my name on it and a future already half paid for, and I looked at Daniel, who raised his glass like I was about to consecrate him, and then I thanked our parents for demonstrating, with impressive clarity, how investment portfolios actually work. You pick a winner, even if his high school GPA took the scenic route, and you bet the farm, and if your daughter asks about the field you sold, you tell her the soil was never that fertile to begin with. There was a small silence, not the polite kind, but the kind where even the air realizes it has been careless, and I reached into my purse and placed the envelope on the linen tablecloth, sliding out photocopies of my loan agreements, the bursar notices marked late, The email where my mother had written, "We thought you'd figure it out," and for flair I included the screenshot of my father's message that read, "Daniel's tuition cleared, relief," complete with the confetti emoji he should never have discovered, and I wasn't cruel. I kept my voice steady, even warm. As I said, I had learned so much about sacrifice from this family, especially how to do it alone, and that my biggest fear had been not the work but the lie. Because lies make you doubt your own eyes, and then I smiled the way waitresses do when a customer swears he didn't order the expensive entree he already ate, and I asked the waiter, gently and sweetly, if he could split the bill by investment share, with the pastas and house salad assigned to exploratory education, and the truffle steak, the wine, and Daniel's dessert with the sparkler tagged to law school returns. I did not throw a drink or cry or storm out. Instead, I tipped the busser in cash on my way to the restroom, because I know exactly who mops up after people pretend to be better than they are, and when I came back, my mother's face had gone through 3 seasons and landed somewhere between frost and thaw, while my father studied the bill as if it had precedent, and Daniel's smile had slipped at the edges like icing taking heat, and I leaned in and told them, with a tone that could have doubled as customer service, that I had applied for an emergency grant that afternoon using a personal statement about resilience and misleading promises, which felt both true and efficient, and I wanted them to know that, going forward, I would be budgeting my presence the same way they had budgeted their money, strategically and without apology. For revenge, I didn't need a grand finale. I simply signed my part of the check, neat and quick, then slid the rest to Daniel with a toast to long-term returns, watched him pat his pockets like a man who just realized the house account is closed, and walked into the night before anyone could rehearse a new script, feeling, for the first time since that phone call, the weight shifting off my chest and onto the people who had spent years pretending it wasn't there, and yet as my phone buzzed with a new email, the scholarship committee had unexpectedly opened an interview slot for the next morning. I knew the game had only changed courts, because the message above it, from my mother, read, "We need to talk about boundaries, and boundaries in our family always came with a price tag." The morning after that dinner, when the hangover of politeness wore off and the scholarship committee's email sat blinking in my inbox like a small green traffic light that had been ignored by everyone but me, I walked into the interview with a pressed shirt, a knot in my stomach, and a story I had polished until it reflected the truth without begging for sympathy, explaining how promises can age faster than children, how an empty college fund can teach discipline faster than any seminar, and how working the late shift while memorizing chemical pathways trains a mind to hold 2 realities at once, because survival is a schedule that doesn't leave room for self-pity, and somehow the man across the table, whose tie had a crooked stripe and whose eyes grew brighter each time I refused to flinch, nodded as if my stubbornness were the missing prerequisite no one prints in the course catalog. By the time I stepped back into the hallway, the call had already come through, a voice telling me that an emergency grant would land in my account by Friday, followed by a mentorship placement with a professor who believed that people who earn their own oxygen rarely waste it, and I thanked the coordinator so calmly you would have thought I won grocery coupons. Though in my chest there was a quiet, steady drum that said, "Keep going, keep going, keep going." My days took on the shape of a rope bridge over a canyon, each plank a shift or a class or a study group that I charged $50 an hour to lead, because I discovered, with a kind of practical delight, that the kids with family credit cards were more than happy to pay someone to turn textbooks into digestible maps, and in the evenings I wrote essays for small local contests with rules that no one read except people like me. And when you string enough little victories together, they look suspiciously like a plan, so that by winter I had carved from the fog a schedule that covered rent, tuition, groceries, and the emergency fund I kept in an envelope labeled, "Do not touch unless something is on fire," which was both literal and metaphorical, because my stove made a sound like a cat when the pilot light went out. Daniel, who had embraced the philosopher's robe of the aspiring attorney without yet mastering the discipline, sent me links to articles about resilience and mindset as if he were the curator of my personal museum of grit, and, while I wanted to laugh, I found it more efficient to monetize the irony, so I tutored LSAT students in the evenings, young men and women who were terrified of conditional logic, and sat up straighter when I explained that most gates in life open with the same key, which is patience disguised as practice, and I pretended not to notice the look on Daniel's face when one of those students recognized me at a coffee shop near his campus and gushed about the score jump I had coached her through, because sometimes revenge does not need witnesses. It just needs to be steady and undeniable. When graduation arrived, mine, not his, I walked across the stage in a pair of shoes that had seen more dishwater than dance floors, and I carried a small, private joy like a talisman, because nobody could take the past few years from me, not the debt I avoided. Not the envelopes I filled, not the hours I traded for credits and credits I turned into a degree. And as I looked out into the crowd, I spotted my parents sitting at the far end of the bleachers with a stiffness that could not be blamed. On aluminum seating, clapping in short bursts as though courtesy had a metronome, and afterwards, in the parking lot where hugs always smell like sunscreen and stress, my mother kissed my cheek and told me she knew I would find my way. And my father said he was proud, their voices carrying that careful neutrality of people auditioning for a role they hadn't rehearsed, while I thanked them kindly and slid into the back seat of a rideshare I paid for myself, because nothing ruins a victory lap faster than debating gas money with people who believe you owe them gratitude for air. The small revenge came a week later, not loud or cruel, but surgical, when I mailed a polite, notarized letter to my university removing both of my parents from every possible emergency, billing, or access authorization, then followed it with a bank update that placed my accounts behind a two-factor gate they would never walk through, and, for a touch of theater I admit I enjoyed, I enclosed with my thank you notes a copy of the anonymous op-ed I had published in the local paper about phantom college funds and the quiet epidemic of promises that evaporate when the bill arrives. A piece that drew more emails than I could answer and made the alumni office call to ask whether I would speak to incoming students about building safety nets that no one else can cut. My parents never mentioned the article, but my aunt forwarded it with 3 clapping hands and the sentence, "You said what we all know," which felt like the universe sliding a receipt across the counter with my name typed neatly in the total line. Time folded, as it does when work replaces narrative, and while Daniel's academic odyssey stretched and meandered and gathered electives like stickers on a suitcase, I took a job that respected my skill and paid me an amount that would have sounded like fantasy 2 years earlier, then moved into an apartment where the heat stayed on without negotiation. And I bought a used car from a woman who cried when I handed her the cashier's check because she was moving to be near her grandchild, and somehow that felt like a blessing passed forward instead of a purchase. And in the evenings I cooked actual meals in actual pans while listening to voicemails from my mother that continued to test the elasticity of the word boundaries. Each message an essay about family loyalty with the footnotes, missing the chapter on mine. I thought perhaps the story had cooled into a lesson I could file away between the tax forms and the warranties, but betrayal has a long echo, and it travels through walls you think are solid, which is why, on a Wednesday afternoon while I was drafting a report and feeling almost boring in the best possible way, my phone lit up with my father's number and, without preamble, his voice carried a fear I had never heard from him, telling me that they needed to see me right away, that something had happened with the house, and that Daniel was in a situation, a phrase so vague and charged it could have meant anything from a flat tire to a disaster. And as he stumbled over details about refinancing and missed payments and the term foreclosure timeline, used like a stick to beat back reality, I looked at the framed copy of my degree on the wall, the one I had paid for with sleep and pride and 1,000 small negotiations, and I felt the old anger stir, not bright and wild anymore, but cool and alert, the way a guard dog lifts its head at a sound in the yard, because the bill my family had deferred had finally come due, and I already knew I would not be the one to pay it. I drove to the house I grew up in with the same muscle memory you used to tie your shoes, only this time the porch light felt accusatory and the shutters looked thinner, as if the wood itself knew you cannot refinance a promise without sanding off a layer of trust. And when I stepped into the kitchen, my mother had set out coffee in the good mugs, the ones reserved for holidays and guests you want to impress, which told me more than the voicemail ever could about how much rehearsal had gone into this meeting, because desperation in our family always dressed up like civility. My father spoke first in a tone that wanted to be managerial and landed somewhere around rattled, explaining that the market had dipped and the roof had leaked and the refinance made sense at the time because the rate was favorable and Daniel's program required focus, and focus required support, and support required cash. And while he pushed a folder toward me as if passing a baton in a race he had not trained for, my mother added that this was what families did. They moved money around like furniture to make room for the next generation, and since I was doing well now, perhaps I could step in, even temporarily, so the bank would calm down. I opened the folder and found a collage of decisions masquerading as inevitabilities. Home equity line draws that lined up with semester due dates and security deposits and a down payment on a car that, judging by the monthly figure, came with stitching you could brag about, and then the late notices, quiet at first and then frantic, like someone waking in the night to smoke and pretending for a few precious minutes that it is just the neighbor grilling. I flipped through statements until the math stopped being abstract and turned into a string of choices that had my name nowhere on them, and when I asked for the full ledger my father bristled as if I had accused him of theft, which in a way I had. Not of money, but of the future I had been told was waiting with my initials engraved. Daniel arrived late in a jacket that tried too hard, strolled past the stack of mail as though envelopes were a lower species, and announced without preamble that his last internship had been unpaid because prestige pays later, which I suppose would have impressed me more if the car keys he tossed on the counter hadn't flashed the logo of a company that uses speed as a synonym for entitlement. I told them I wanted to see the numbers end to end, so I spread the statements and the loan documents across the table in rows the way you lay out a puzzle and start with the edges. And I sketched cash flows on a legal pad the bank had probably mailed as a cheerful perk, labeling what went where and when and why, narrating the timeline in the same calm voice I used to tame panic in freshmen who discovered, halfway through a semester, that attendance counts, and piece by piece a picture emerged that none of them wanted to look at directly. The house had been turned into an ATM for Daniel's launch, not out of malice, but out of a faith so lopsided it had become a gamble. And now the lender wanted chips back from a family that believed the dealer would accept gratitude as currency. My mother cried softly into a napkin that left little white lint on her face. My father stared at a fixed point as if willing a different ledger to appear, and Daniel cleared his throat and suggested that I cosign a small bridge loan while he completed his trajectory, which was an elegant way to say he planned to stay insulated while the structure holding him up creaked. I reminded them that I had already learned to rescue myself without collateral from anyone in this room, and then, because revenge done properly is administration rather than theater, I pulled from my bag a neat stack of papers I had spent the previous night preparing, a simple, specific plan titled with the kind of clarity bureaucrats respect, outlining what would need to happen for any outside dollar to touch this problem. Starting with the immediate sale of Daniel's car, the termination of his luxury lease, a documented job with pay stubs that could withstand a lender's audit, and a signed promissory note acknowledging that every dollar previously extracted from the house for his benefit would be repaid to the household before a single new expense was considered, along with a calendar of required payments and a clause that converted any missed installment into automatic notice to the lender that the family could not sustain the debt. Daniel laughed, not because he found it funny but because laughter was the last tool in his kit that still felt like control, and asked whether I was serious, as if seriousness were a costume I had borrowed for effect rather than the material my life had been cut from for years. I told him seriousness was the reason I was still standing, and then I performed the kind of quiet retaliation that looks, on paper, like due diligence. I took out my phone, dialed the loss mitigation officer whose name I had written at the top of my notes, and, with the speaker turned up just enough to make the room listen, I stated clearly that I was not a borrower, that I would not cosign, that I would not contribute funds, and that I would be emailing a simple cash flow analysis showing That prior draws on the equity line had been used to fund an adult dependent's education and lifestyle rather than essential maintenance, a fact that did not change the bank's calculus, but did change its appetite for extensions without borrower concessions. Then I forwarded, while they watched, a prepared packet to the officer and, in a separate message, to the university's character and fitness office that oversees professional readiness, not as a vendetta but as documentation that the person who would one day hold clients' futures in his hands had been living on money extracted from a lie, a fact pattern more educational than any seminar on ethics I could buy him. The silence that followed did not feel triumphant. It felt clean, like the air after a storm when the power is still out but the humidity has broken, and I gathered the pages into their labeled folders, placed them gently back in the center of the table, and told my parents that I would attend the meeting at the bank the next morning as an observer only, that my role would be to verify and to record, and that the path forward required decisions I could not and would not make for them. My mother reached for my hand and asked whether there was another way, something private, something that did not involve outside eyes, but privacy, I said, had been the mask that let this mess grow teeth, and if there was going to be light, it would be bright and official. When I left, Daniel called after me with a curse he tried to lace with sophistication and failed. My father repeated my name like a bargaining chip he was unwilling to cash, and my mother said she understood even though she did not, and as I closed the front door I slid the deadbolt, a habit I had never had in this house, and felt, in the click, a small, exact satisfaction that was not joy and not cruelty, only the sound of the boundary they kept threatening finally locking into place. While the real blow, the one I kept to myself, sat scheduled on my calendar for early morning, when a banker with a neat tie would ask my parents to explain why the line labeled Daniel was now the only line that mattered. The meeting at the bank the following morning was antiseptic in its orderliness, the walls painted a neutral beige that seemed designed to lull borrowers into believing the stakes were lower than they were, though the folders stacked in front of my parents made it clear that no shade of paint could disguise the fact that they were drowning in obligations they had written themselves into. The loan officer, a man whose tie was knotted too tightly, greeted us with the polite efficiency of someone who has repeated the same grim script so often that he no longer hears the words he delivers. My father attempted to steer the conversation into anecdotes about market fluctuations, deferred opportunities, and how law school was a family legacy investment, while my mother nodded along with that weary smile that hoped charm might soften numbers. But the officer interrupted them with the blunt recitation of dates and arrears, his pen tapping each missed payment as if to punctuate a story that had only one ending unless something drastically changed. I sat quietly, hands folded, deliberately presenting myself not as a daughter, but as an observer, and the silence of my refusal grew heavier with every passing minute, until even the officer glanced at me, perhaps expecting me to intervene, to play the role of responsible child who rescues the family honor. Instead, I met his gaze and said clearly that my finances were entirely separate, that my name was not on any of these documents, and that I was present only to ensure transparency. The flicker in his eyes was almost imperceptible, but I recognized it as the signal of someone who had seen this dynamic before, who had watched parents bet on one child while assuming the other would be their insurance policy. And in that moment the myth my parents had crafted for years crumbled under the cold light of paperwork. Daniel, who had slouched into the chair beside them with the air of someone unfairly inconvenienced, tried to interject with talk of future salaries, of law firms ready to scoop him up, of the prestige that would make all of this temporary chaos worthwhile. But his words rang hollow against the officer's ledger, and when pressed for proof, for offers, for anything tangible, he could produce nothing beyond vague assurances. My father's face tightened, my mother dabbed her eyes, and Daniel shifted uncomfortably, realizing perhaps for the first time that his parachute had been sewn together by hands that were now trembling. The officer closed the file with a crisp motion and explained the choices available: restructure under harsher terms, sell assets to cover the arrears, or risk foreclosure. His voice carried no judgment, only the finality of arithmetic. My parents turned toward me then, their eyes wide with the unspoken plea that blood is supposed to override balance sheets, but I did not move, did not soften, because I remembered the noodles eaten cold after double shifts, the nights spent calculating how to stretch $20 into groceries and gas, the way they had smiled while telling me my college fund was safe. My revenge was not loud or cruel, it was the steady, unwavering refusal to erase the consequences they had written for themselves. When the meeting ended, I walked out before they could ask again, the sound of their voices muffled behind me, and for the first time I felt no obligation to turn back. In the weeks that followed, I heard through relatives that the car was sold, that Daniel had moved back into the house he once mocked as too small for his ambitions, and that my parents spoke in lowered voices about refinancing again, though the options were dwindling. They called me, left messages filled with alternating tones of guilt and outrage, claiming that I had abandoned them, that I had forgotten what it meant to be family, but I saved those recordings without responding. A private archive of reminders that loyalty built on lies is nothing but a leash. And yet, late at night, when the city outside my apartment fell into its quiet hum and I stared at the ceiling with the weight of silence pressing down, I sometimes wondered whether I had gone too far. Whether in choosing justice for myself I had become as cold as the people I had once despised. I knew I would never send them money, never allow my accounts to be their lifeline, never undo the lessons I had bled for, but I also knew that revenge, even when deserved, does not untangle every knot. It leaves you with questions that do not fade. Was I reclaiming my life, or was I cutting ties so completely that no thread of family remained? The last time I saw them was months later, in the grocery store parking lot, where my mother clutched a coupon booklet and my father pushed a cart with one squeaky wheel, and for a moment we locked eyes across the lanes of cars. They did not wave, and I did not nod. We simply existed in parallel, lives that once intersected now running side by side but never touching, and as I drove away I felt the strange mix of freedom and finality that comes when you realize the bridge behind you is burned without smoke or flame. Only the quiet certainty that it will never carry weight again. Whether that makes me heartless or simply honest is not a question I can answer, but it is one that lingers, and perhaps that is the truest revenge of all.